The caller. I never believed in ghosts, or monsters, or anything supernatural for that matter, but that was before tonight. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. My parents had left for a weekend trip, leaving me home alone in the comfort of our house, a two-story colonial with an aging roof and creaky floorboards. I'd planned on doing what any self-respecting 16-year-old would, binge-watching horror movies and raiding the fridge for snacks. I was used to being alone. I'd been home alone plenty of times before. But I didn't expect this. It all started with a phone call, and I was sprawled on the couch scrolling through Netflix when the house phone, an old landline model that my parents had kept for nostalgia's sake, rang. The sound echoed through the quiet house, slicing through the muffled noise of the movie. I picked it up, not thinking much of it, probably a telemarketer. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end, too long. Hello, I repeated, frowning. Who's there? And then a voice, low, breathy, almost like it was whispering just a little too close to the receiver, spoke. You're all alone, aren't you? I froze. Who is this? I asked, my pulse quickening. I suddenly felt very aware of how empty the house was. It was just me, the house, and the oppressive silence that filled the air. There was no response, just the faintest crackle from the other end, and then the line went dead. I held the receiver for a long moment, staring at the wall, trying to shake off the strange sense of unease that had settled in my chest. It was probably some prankster, someone trying to spook me. It happened all the time in the movies, but as I placed the phone back in its cradle, something felt off. I shrugged it off. I wasn't a kid anymore after all. I was fine, but that's when I heard it, a soft thud. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe the house settling, but then it came again, a little louder this time, coming from upstairs. I sat up, tense, listening intently. Nothing. I got up and walked to the bottom of the stairs, peering into the dimly lit hallway that stretched down the second floor. The shadows of the banister and furniture loomed like dark shapes, but there was no sign of movement. Shaking my head, I started back toward the living room, but just as I was about to sit down, there it was again, a thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I froze. That wasn't the wind. The only door upstairs that creaked like that was the one to my parents' bedroom. It had been closed when I left the room earlier. I was sure of it. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy glass vase, and crept toward the stairs. My heart was pounding in my ears now. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an intruder. Maybe a burglar. Maybe nothing at all. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone or something was upstairs. I climbed the stairs cautiously, one slow step at a time. The thud had stopped, and the house seemed unnervingly quiet. When I reached the top, I hesitated at the hallway, glancing in both directions. Everything appeared normal. The bathroom door was shut, the closet door was shut, and the door to my parents' bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness on the other side. I didn't want to check. I didn't want to see anything that would confirm the growing dread clawing at my chest. But curiosity, the kind you get when you're alone and something doesn't feel right, pushed me forward. I pushed open the door. The room was dark except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside filtering in through the blinds. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken windows. No sign of forced entry. But the bed was made as though my parents had just stepped out. And on the pillow, there was something I hadn't noticed before, a small dark stain on the fabric. It was too round to be a spill and too dark to be anything normal. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out to touch it. My fingers barely brushed the fabric when the phone rang again. This time it was different. The sound was louder, sharper, more insistent. I bolted down the stairs before I could think twice, my pulse thrumming in my throat. By the time I reached the kitchen, the phone had stopped ringing. But the silence was back, more oppressive than before. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes your skin crawl, makes every small sound feel like a looming threat. I snatched the receiver from its cradle, my hand trembling. This is getting old, I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. Who is this? The voice on the other end wasn't a whisper this time. It was deeper, more distorted, like it was being dragged through thick static. I'm in your house. I screamed and slammed the phone down so hard it nearly broke. My head was spinning. There was no way. No way. I was imagining things. It had to be a prank. It had to be. But then, just as I turned toward the back door, ready to bolt and call the cops, I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps on the floorboards upstairs, slow, methodical, almost like someone was pacing. I rushed to the window, pulled back the curtain, and saw nothing but the street lamps glowing eerily in the distance. The driveway was empty. My parents' car was still gone. And yet those footsteps. I ran upstairs, heart hammering in my chest. The door to my parents' room was wide open now. And the bed where I'd seen the stain just moments before, was empty. Except for one thing, the pillow where the stain had been was now soaked in dark red. And in the middle of it there was a message, scrawled in what could only be blood. I'm not alone anymore. I turned, and there in the hallway, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a man. No, not a man, it wasn't human, and I didn't get a chance to scream. If you are still here, please tell us where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to click the subscribe button and like for more scary stories. The man outside. I was 15 years old, and it was just an average night, around 8 p.m., when I found myself babysitting my little cousin at his house. My mom and aunt were out shopping, and my dad and uncle were at the movie theater. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, just me and my cousin watching TV, killing time until our parents came home. But something felt off. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the longer I sat there, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. I tried to ignore it and kept watching the TV, but it wasn't going away. I decided to get up and check the back door. We had a small house, and it was easy to just make sure everything was locked. I turned the handle, gave it a tug, and locked it. As I walked back through the kitchen, that's when I saw him. A man. A very strange, very unsettling man. He was standing outside, staring into the window. I could see him clearly through the glass, dirty, disheveled, with wild hair and a sunken face. He looked like a homeless man, but there was something about the way he stood there, perfectly still, that sent a cold shiver down my spine. His eyes were fixed on us, unblinking. I froze. My protective instinct kicked in immediately, and I tried to stay calm. I didn't want to scare my little cousin, so I pretended I hadn't seen the man. I quickly turned to him and said, "Hey, buddy, I think it's getting late. We should go upstairs. Our parents will be home soon, and they won't want you staying up too late." I tried to sound casual, but I was anything but calm inside. My heart was pounding. We went upstairs, and I tucked my cousin into bed, trying to act as if everything was normal. But I knew damn well there was a man outside. And I knew he wasn't there just to say hello. I was about 125 pounds and 5'8" at the time. I wasn't exactly a tough guy, but I played football for my school, so I had some strength. Still, nothing about this situation felt safe. My first instinct was to grab something to defend myself, just in case. I went downstairs again, this time straight to the kitchen. I opened the drawer where my aunt kept the meat tenderizer, and I grabbed the heavy silver hammer. It felt solid in my hand, and for the first time that night, I felt a little more in control. I walked back toward the window where I had seen the man, but now he was gone. I sprinted to the front door and double-checked the locks. The deadbolt was secure, and the doorknob was locked tight. I ran back upstairs, still holding the meat tenderizer, and went into my cousin's room. I sat down by the door, the hammer in my lap, and just waited. My cousin looked at me with wide eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked. I tried to sound reassuring, but I could barely keep the tremor out of my voice. "Just keep your head down, okay? Stay quiet. Don't open the door for anyone." I quickly called my mom and told her what had happened. She said she would call the police. I called my dad and uncle too, but they were at least 45 minutes away. The police said they would be there in about 30 minutes. That's when I heard it, a window shattering, and I could hear the distinct sound of glass breaking, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the floor downstairs. Whoever the man was, he was inside. My stomach dropped. I whispered to my cousin, "Stay calm. Hide under the covers. Don't make a sound." I heard the man walking around on the main floor, the sound of his boots scraping the floorboards. Every step made my heart race faster. I was holding the meat tenderizer so tight my hands started to ache, but I couldn't relax. I just waited, trying to control my breathing, praying the police would get here in time. I could hear the man moving through the house, his boots tapping against the wood floors, opening doors. My pulse was in my throat, and my palms were slick with sweat. Then the footsteps stopped. I heard the man opening the door to my aunt and uncle's bedroom. He was close. So close. My cousin's door was barely 10 feet from the stairs, and the man was moving toward it. He paused, just outside the door, and I held my breath. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then I heard the man move again, walking toward the bathroom, and then down the stairs. I could hear him going into the basement. I gripped the meat tenderizer harder, but my legs felt like they were going to give out. My heart was hammering in my chest. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the police arrive. I could hear their voices, shouting commands as they burst through the door. It was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The officers quickly moved through the house, and it wasn't long before they found the man. It turned out he had escaped from a mental hospital several provinces away. He had been on the run for days, and I was lucky that the police got there when they did. The officers assured me everything was fine, but I was shaken to my core. I later learned that the man had been living in a facility for people with severe mental health issues. He had somehow gotten loose, and no one had been able to find him until that night. It was a terrifying experience that I'll never forget. At 14 years old, I thought I might have to fight a grown man off with a meat tenderizer. And for a while, I wasn't sure if I was going to make it out of that situation alive. The man was taken into custody, and the police promised us they would do everything to ensure he wouldn't come back. I never heard from him again, but the memory of that night, the fear, the sound of his boots on the stairs, it still haunts me. Even now, when I sit alone in the house, I sometimes feel that same unease creeping back. But at least next time I'll be ready. The man on my patio. This happened when I was about 9 years old. I'm 23 now and I still think about it. It still gives me goosebumps, even as I sit here today and write this down. I live in a terrace house in a pretty crowded neighborhood, and me and my neighbors all have our own little patios. There's a small road about 10 meters from my yard where people usually walk on Sundays. A small fence separates my yard from that road, and I was used to seeing people walk by, wave hello, and go about their business. But seeing someone standing on my patio was something entirely different. At the time, I'd only been home alone for about an hour. My school was just a short walk away, only 50 meters, and my mom worked nearby. She always figured I was old enough to be home alone for that short period of time before she came back from work. I made sure I locked the front door and double-checked the back door leading to the patio, just like she told me. After that, I rushed upstairs to my room to play as much PlayStation as I could before I had to do my homework. It was around then that I heard a sound from outside my window. It was faint at first, like a cat's meowing. But I hadn't seen my cat in over 3 months. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had come back. I quickly ran downstairs to check. What I saw next will stay with me forever. There, standing on my patio, was a tall man with black hair covering half his face. He looked like something out of a horror movie, like a male version of the woman from The Ring. The most unsettling thing wasn't just the way he looked, though. It was the sound he was making. It wasn't a regular meow. No, it was a high-pitched, almost distorted noise that sounded like a cat in distress. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked closer. He wasn't just making the sound, though. He was also spitting out cigarette butts. My dad used to smoke, and the man was hunched over my dad's old ashtray on the patio, eating the cigarette stubs. Brown liquid dripped from his mouth as he made that unsettling noise. I froze. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I knew something wasn't right. I just stood there staring at him. Then I snapped out of it. I screamed as loudly as I could. The man didn't react. He just continued to eat the cigarette stubs, unfazed by my presence. I ran back upstairs to my room, locked the door behind me, and called my mom. She immediately called the police. I could still hear that horrible high-pitched noise as I huddled in bed under my sheets, shivering with fear. The sound seemed to get louder, like he was getting closer. I thought I was going to be sick. I must have blacked out for a moment because the next thing I remember is hearing the police arrive. I heard them talking to the man on the road near my house, telling him to get away from the fence or they would arrest him. The man didn't say a word. Instead, the high-pitched sound grew even more frantic, louder, almost deafening. I cautiously peeked through my window, hoping the police would handle it. I could see 2 officers by my fence, a man and a woman, but the man I had seen on the patio was no longer there. He had somehow moved under my window out of sight. And then I heard a commotion. The police officers jumped over the fence, and the next thing I knew, I heard the man scream. It wasn't a scream I'll ever forget. It was primal, guttural, and filled with rage. He charged at the female officer with a force I can't describe, knocking her out cold. The male officer immediately tased the man, but even then, he was still thrashing around, screaming at the top of his lungs. The police struggled to get him under control, but eventually they managed to cuff him. The male officer checked on the female officer, who was badly hurt, and called for backup and an ambulance. It felt like forever before everything settled down. Through it all, I stood at the window, watching in shock. The male officer looked up at me, and I'll never forget the expression on his face. He must have seen how terrified I was because he said, "I hope you didn't see all that." I couldn't stop myself. I started to cry. My neighbors began to come out of their houses to see what was happening. One elderly woman even came over to check on me and took me inside. She comforted me until my mom got home. The police then took the man away, but they promised they would come back later to explain everything. And they did. That night, the male officer returned with some shocking news. He told us that the man who had been on my patio was actually diagnosed with severe autism. He had escaped from a nearby facility about 5 kilometers away. The officer explained that this man had lived in our house 5 years earlier, before he had been moved out when his mother, his only caretaker, died. The man had been incredibly strong, which explained his violent reaction to the police when they arrived. Apparently, the man thought he was returning to his old home, searching for his mother. He missed the routines they had shared in the house, and he probably didn't understand what had happened. The officer promised that this wouldn't happen again. I tried to put it out of my mind after that. I went through a few sleepless nights, but eventually, life returned to normal. I went on with my childhood, and I didn't think about that man for years. That is, until last year. I had moved into the house when my parents sold it to me. It was a strange feeling, knowing that I was now living in the same house where that horrible incident had happened. I was sitting outside on my patio one morning, enjoying my coffee, when I saw him. The same man, gray hair now, but still standing there staring at me from the road by my fence. I froze. My heart began to race. And then, I heard it. That high-pitched noise, the same one from all those years ago. I remembered everything instantly, the fear, the terror, but also something else, something I hadn't felt before. Sympathy. He had escaped again. I realized that he wasn't a monster, just a man who had been through something unimaginable, searching for something he'd lost. I didn't feel afraid anymore, just sad. I decided to approach him, cautiously. I asked him if he wanted to come down to the patio, and to my surprise, he jumped the fence without hesitation. For a moment, I thought he might react the same way he had when he attacked the police officer, but instead, he just smiled. It was a simple, innocent smile. I invited him inside, and when he sat down on my couch, he immediately turned on the TV and flipped it to cartoons. It was as if he had come home. He was so absorbed in the cartoons that it almost made me tear up. He was just a child, in his own mind, lost in a world that made sense to him. I had to call the facility that had been caring for him. They came within 10 minutes and gently persuaded him to return with them. As they left, I could see the sadness in his eyes, and I couldn't help but feel for him. 2 days later, I called the facility again. We made an arrangement. His name is Tom, and every Sunday since that day, Tom and his caretakers come over to visit me. We sit together and watch cartoons. It's the highlight of his week, and now it's become the highlight of mine too. Where I once dreaded meeting that man on my patio, I now look forward to seeing him every week. Tom is no longer just a memory from my childhood. He's a friend, and I wouldn't have it any other way.